Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Sheen Center Online. The Sheen Center is a project of the Archdiocese of New York, and this is our Faith, Hope, and Love series, which is our free public streaming content, which we're offering while we are unable to gather together in person down at the Sheen Center. I think this afternoon we have a really great conversation. The French philosopher and Dominican priest Antonin Serdelanges once wrote that the future is always the heir of the past. Now, how we pass on that past, particularly through the stories we tell or fail to tell, has real consequences both for our present and our future. To discuss that intersection between history and story, we're joined today by award-winning playwright Judy Tate. And before we bring Judy on, let me tell you a little bit more about her. In addition to being an award-winning playwright, Judy is a 4-time Emmy Award winner, a 20-plus year member of Ensemble Studio Theater, the co-founder and producing artistic director of the American Slavery Project, and co-artistic director of Stargate Theater Company, a project of the Manhattan Theater Club, which employs court-involved youth to write and perform original plays. A professional actor for many years, Judy has worked in theaters throughout the United States and in Southern Africa. As a teaching artist, she has worked with playwriting students in alternative schools, prisons, shelters, from reservations and townships, both independently and with Manhattan Theater Club, Theater Development Fund, and the International Theater and Literacy Project. I'm also happy to say that Judy is a dear friend of the Sheen Center, with whom we have collaborated on several American Slavery Project productions, including Unheard Voices, Haunted Files, and most recently, Black Women in the Ballot. It's my pleasure to welcome Judy Tate.
Hi, how are you?
Good, Judy. How are you today?
I am wonderful. It is so wonderful to be here, almost in the same room with you.
Absolutely. Well, we'll make do with this virtual conversation, but I think it's going to be great.
Yeah.
You know, as a writer, you deal mostly in or at least the projects that we've worked together on, these personal narratives. But your own personal narrative is quite multifaceted. I mean, you're a playwright, an award-winning playwright, a historian, an educator. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and how you got involved in writing?
It's kind of a funny, well, I don't know how funny it is. We'll let your audience decide. I studied acting in college. I went to NYU. I studied with the dynamic and famous Stella Adler. And then after I got out of school, I had an acting career. I started out with Crossroads Theater Company when it was a repertory company. And I got my feet wet that way. A year we were a part of a repertory company, maybe a little more than a year. And then I was going out on the road doing regional theater. And when I had my daughter, it occurred to me that I couldn't keep going on the road and dragging her out of school and things like that. I don't know why it didn't occur to me that you can just pick up your daughter. I guess people do, but I thought she needed a more stable life than that. And so I thought to myself, well, what can I do to live a creative life? And that was really the purpose. You know, I really had to live a creative life. And what could I do to stay in New York and have her be in school and be stable and live that creative life? And I thought, well, I have stories and there are things that I wanted to tell. And so I started writing. And very quickly after I started writing, I got picked up for television. And there were a lot of daytime television shows in New York at the time. And I was very lucky to be part of that window. And I got my foot in, and I was working in television for over a decade and writing plays. And so you can thank my little baby.
Well, it was certainly a good decision and paid off creatively. You are we at the Sheen Center know you most through our collaborations on various American Slavery Project productions. Now, you're a co-founder of the American Slavery Project. And as I mentioned, we had worked on both Unheard Voices and Haunted Files. Can you tell us a little bit about American Slavery Project and how you got involved in that and the origin of that whole initiative?
Sure. It was during 2011, the beginning of the 150th anniversary of the beginning of the Civil War. And people started celebrating the Civil War. And in southern states, they were having Confederate balls and mock inaugurations of Jefferson Davis, reimagining the Confederacy, flying Confederate flags over Capitol buildings. And I was appalled. I mean, I don't know if you can imagine what it's like for a Black person to stand under a Confederate flag. It must be very similar to a Jewish person having to stand under a Nazi flag. And I was just done. And at the same time in New York, people were producing plays. There were 3 main stage productions, in fact, about this time period. And none of those productions had African-American writers attached to them. And I thought, well, this is odd. I have a play during that period, and a lot of my African-American playwright friends had been shopping around plays that were really, really wonderful and skillfully written. And none of them had gotten too many bites on their plays. So I put out a call to action saying this is an important year. We have got to reframe this conversation in America, and we have to reframe this conversation in the theater community. So 2 people answered that call to action. Keith Joseph Adkins, who was the artistic director of the New Black Fest, which has a festival every year of plays written by men and women in the African diaspora, and Godfrey Simmons, who went on to found Civic Ensemble. And so the 3 of us had a play reading series by African American writers of plays of this era. And it went from February, Black History Month, through Juneteenth. And then after, we called it the American Slavery Series, a project of the New Black Fest. And afterwards, I said, this is too important. And I created the American Slavery Project at the website that you know now, www.americanslaveryproject.org. And our mission is to center African-American writers who are writing about the era of Black beginnings in America. So that's enslavement through Jim Crow, through the Civil Rights era, and today. To have workshops, we have an education program to educate people, and like the Sheen Center, to create conversation in the community. So there's always conversation accompanying any of the shows that we do. So that's how we got started.
Well, that's great. And I want to certainly circle back at a little later about that whole idea of stories being opportunities for conversation. Can you talk a little bit about the 2 specific projects that we worked on at the Sheen Center? The first one was Unheard Voices, which has a real interesting genesis behind it.
It does. Unheard Voices is a collectively written theater piece, illuminating, animating some of the 400 and plus bodies that were excavated in the mid-90s during the excavation for the federal office building. There are about 10 to 30,000 people buried down at the African Burial Ground in Lower Manhattan. It's between Broadway and Elk, so Duane and Reed Street. And it was originally opened between 1690 and 1790. And in the early to mid 90s, during the excavation for this office building, they found these bodies, the 400 I spoke about a second ago. I happened to be living downtown at the time, and my husband was a flaneur. He liked to just walk around, and and he walked around at night a lot. And it was the middle of the night, and he came upon these drummers at this site the word had gotten out that bodies had been discovered, and people knew. There were Black communities and also indigenous communities that had used that burial ground, and through the drums he called people. And so he woke my daughter up, he woke me up, said there's something going on. We went over, and it was absolutely astounding to learn what had happened there. This is where African American people during the colonial era were forced to bury their dead several miles outside of the city limits at the time. And so David Dinkins was in office, and he stopped the building. And there, I will fast forward, there were a lot of negotiations around what to do with the property, who should examine the bodies. They brought people up eventually from Howard University who understood what these bodies were, how to examine them, and what might be valuable in the crypts. For example, the first people to come were throwing cowrie shells away. Well, cowrie shells were from the old country, from West Africa, and when people were buried with those, it was very, very important. So anyway, fast forward several years, the burial ground became an historic site, and there is a museum attached to it. And I was sitting in that burial ground, looking at the engravings on the stones, and the scientists who examined the bodies could tell what kind of work someone did from the stress on the bones. They could tell whether they were male or female from the pelvis. They could tell from the teeth and the chemicals in the teeth, whether they had been born on the continent of Africa or here, on this continent, or if they had come from the Caribbean, where Africans were often sent first to be seasoned before they came here. But the only thing, and they could tell their approximate age, the only thing that was missing were names. And I said, this is like a burial without names. And boom, I said, this is what artists do. We create people, playwrights create human beings, create characters. And so we could study the era. We could, visit with historians. We could visit the library. We could have people come in and talk to us. And we could go through the contents of these graves, and we could give these people a voice, finally, who didn't have a voice. And so that's what we did. And now we have an hour-long theater piece. We actually have several versions. Over 50% of the bodies down there are young people, children. And so we have a version with mostly young people's voices. But we call it Unheard Voices, and it has drumming and it has African singing, and you get to hear what these people's lives might have been like. And it sounds like, oh my God, enslavement during the colonial era. But these are actually stories that have many, many different kinds of feelings to them. They are stories of ordinary people that lived in what we look back on as extraordinary times. How in the world did they survive? But as one of our historians and attorney who came to speak with us, she said, well, what amazes me is that they loved anyway. So we have love stories, we have children's stories, everything that anybody went through, enslaved people went through. And so these are their voices.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the play is powerful on many levels, the obvious emotional power of it, but it is that sense of just giving them a human face and a human voice that, like you said, that just really encompasses the whole scope of humanity, that, like you said, all different ages, all different experiences. Can we go a little deeper? There's an African proverb that says, as long as someone speaks my name, I will live forever. Can you go a little bit more into that idea of that part of the motivation was because of that anonymity, that idea that nobody could even know who these people were. So obviously you had to use your creativity to give them names and faces and histories to really keep those those people alive?
Yes, I was thinking about, it's very personal for me. My family's not from New York or colonial, they weren't in colonial New York. They were from the South, but I could only go back in my own history to a certain point because there's no history left. There's chattel. My grandmother's sister wrote a history of my family as far as she could recall, and it was 2 pages long. And so I think that African proverb did not take into account the generations of children after that proverb that would not know who spoke that. So it's not just their name, but just remembering their humanity, right? So a lot of our writers gave these people names, and that's a marker, a present day marker to mark their humanity. We don't actually know what their names were because they're not entered into, household ledgers, just, 1 female, 2 black males, that kind of thing. But we could look in the contents of those graves and imagine who those people were and give them a name where they didn't have a name. And I think, I don't know if I made that connection really well. Wanting to knowing personally what it's like not to have but a couple generations of history. I'm just 2 generations out of enslavement. My grandmother's older brothers and sisters were born enslaved. She was the first one born just outside of enslavement. And we don't know. We just don't know a lot about who we were, and that hurts. That devastates me that there are 10 to 30,000 people underground there, and they weren't given the dignity of a report of who they were. Does that make sense?
It does. It's tragic. Another quote that sort of struck me as I was preparing for today's conversation, Maya Angelou said that there's no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside of you. Now there's the stories that you tell in Unheard Voices. There's also the stories that you tell in Haunted Files, which is another production of American Slavery Project that we were fortunate enough to have at the Sheen Center. Can you talk a little bit about those stories and what motivated you to not keep that story inside, to tell that story?
Oh, look at that. What you just put up is, that middle person is my grandmother, by the way. I just thought I'd tell you that. That was washing day at the turn of the century. The Haunted Files happened because I stumbled on this show about eugenics that was being done down at NYU in association with the Pan-Asian Pacific Institute. And they had collected all the artifacts from the Eugenics Society. And for those of you in the audience who don't know, eugenics was the pseudoscience that tried to establish and keep in place white supremacy. And it was just insane. And it finally lost credibility and went defunct when the ultimate eugenicist act was the concentration camps and the ovens. And then people said, oh my goodness, this is what eugenics does, right? But anyway, they had collected all of these artifacts, and they had files in there of people who had worked for and also moved through the Eugenics Society, including a woman named Hazel, who eventually was sterilized against her will, based on the fact that she was found to be, by the Eugenics Society, she was found to be immoral. Well, this woman simply was poor, and she did not, really, these were people were demonized for sociological and systemic issues in our society. The people that were the victims of these issues were demonized and then sterilized and sent away and institutionalized. And so we wrapped Hazel's life story, which was in the file, what happened to her at different times. I turned those events into turning points in a human being's life. And then we found the story of a field worker, which were the kind of eugenicist social workers who might have interacted with her. And we intertwined that. And the funny thing is I don't know, you remember, we brought all these artifacts into the theater and people got to go through them like they were in a gallery and see things like, oh, the steps of imbecility, just horrible, horrible things. But the thing that struck me the most when I was watching that again was how close to some of the language today that people use against immigrants, against anybody that does not look like the dominant culture. The very same language is used to demonize these people that was used to demonize people in the late 20s, all the 30s and the 40s that led to, the final solution.
Well, yeah, it's like Faulkner said, the past is never really past. So
it isn't. It really isn't. It was stunning, and I think people said that when we presented the haunted file.
Yeah, it's interesting how in both those examples, you, as an artist, you came back to the idea of wrapping a story around it. So maybe we can talk a little bit about it's ironic that the word story and story is in history.
Yes.
So let's talk a little bit about that intersection. And, storytellers have always played in every culture at every time an important role in passing on a community or a culture's idea of itself. Can you talk a little bit about that role of not only speaking about how stories talk to us where we have been as a people, but where we are at this moment, the importance of storytelling at this moment?
Oh, yes, because nothing in the present exists without having gone through the steps of the past, right? And it's hard to put anything in the present moment if you don't have a context for it, like in the Black Lives Matter protest, and bless those children, those of us who have underlying conditions and it's difficult for us to be out. I just say all power to the young people. But this period of time where we're seeing so much brutality by police, this policing has been, cropping up forever since the slave patrols existed. Policing comes out of that. I was reading today about how, poor people. I think this happened in one of the revolts, one of the slave revolts in New York, but it also happened in Virginia. Poor whites, poor blacks got together, decided, we've got more in common than we do apart, right? And revolted, at which time they made those often Irish poor whites that had come over as indentured servants overseers of the enslaved people, so that they had a reason to feel superior, right? Divide and conquer, divide and conquer, divide and conquer. You'll see this over and over again. You see the brutality of the police, and then those people that were overseers became the slave patrol, and sort of the precursor of modern policing today. It's you've got to have context, and reading history gives us our context for the day.
You spoke there about trying to find that commonality, and I think what's important to find that commonality is to be engaged in a conversation.
Mm.
You know, James Baldwin once wrote that not everything that you face can be changed, but you can't change anything without at least first facing it. Do you think that storytelling offers a way to face, you know, with sober-eyed clarity, those things that need to be faced, even if they're difficult or painful, but in a way that invites opposites into a conversation rather than a confrontation?
I absolutely do feel that. And, you know, part of my writing, or even my collating, like we did with Unheard Voices, I really think it's important to put everybody's point of view out there. So, for example, we just did Black Women in the Ballot, right? And I wanted to write Alice Paul and Mary Church Terrell as full human beings with full points of view. I didn't want to make Alice Paul the villain in the story, but she had a strategy that excluded Black women. And so, you know, rather than make her, she's the bad white woman who comes in, I wanted to explore her strategy and give her a voice for that. That Mary Church Terrell could debate with her and say, look, these things that you have said, these strategies are good for you, and we can get behind those strategies. But I cannot get behind the strategy of leaving Black women behind by white women. They're climbing up the ladder and then they're going to pull it up before we can get a rung. I cannot stand behind that. And so only if you write the full story of that do you get to see human beings really trying to wrestle with what was in their day, maybe complicated, complicated decisions. If you only have one point of view, and if you can't write the people that you disagree with fully and really understand their argument, then you're not writing a play, you're writing propaganda. And I'm just not interested in propaganda. I'm interested in plays that give people like, oh, that never occurred to me. Oh, maybe that's why, so Black people can see white suffragettes for what they were facing, having to turn Southern women around, to help turn the vote. And, white people can see what Black people were facing. I think that's really key, And, it's funny you mentioned Baldwin, because I have just been reading so much Baldwin lately. He says things that sound like today. They were so radical in his day. And now I think he can be heard with fresh ears. Yeah, it's really amazing. Yeah, story. There's nothing like it, right? Story.
Before the event, you and I were talking, and you were talking about that James Baldwin wanted both a conversation and a confrontation, but an intellectual confrontation, obviously. And I think that always reminded me, a favorite author of mine, G.K. Chesterton. He would always say he would never back away from an argument. And he said, but you had to be careful to make sure that an argument never turned into a disagreement, or a disagreement never turned into an argument, in the sense that you can disagree, but you can still recognize the humanity in the person that you're disagreeing with. And hopefully you can have an intellectual conversation with them and hopefully learn from that conversation. So I don't know if that comes into play in what you were just talking about.
Yeah, and for me as a writer, that, when I'm writing a debate play, especially, comes into play, like with Black Women in the Ballot. Those plays where I get to imagine adversaries, but, respectful, worthy adversaries, kind of like, the Japanese, how they bow before they fight. There's a respect for having a worthy adversary. And I think, for example, like Mary Church Terrell and Alice Paul were worthy adversaries. Alice Paul gave in, by the way. Those of you out there that don't know or haven't seen it, you can see it on Sheen Center's website. Yes. So if you want to see those short plays, do that. They'll be up till the 30th. But I think that you've gotta write. Well, I do. I have to write in a way that I hear everybody's point of view. I have to write that way. I have a play that takes place in the South in 1845 because I was trying to figure out a number of things. Sometimes it's this burning story, like you were saying that Maya Angelou said you have a burning story. A lot of times for me, it's a burning question. It's not a whole burning story. It's a burning question. And it's a question of, where did I come from? Once again, I'm African American. Both of my parents are African American. All four of my grandparents are African American. And yet we all look like this. Well, you know where this is going, right? It's going to slave rates, right? And if we want to talk about just blood, that means, I identify as African American because, one drop and that's what you are and you're enslaved. And that was so that the people who enslaved others could own even their progeny. But I have this other blood running through me. So, so I asked that question, what does that mean? What does that mean to have both blood running through you, so to speak? What does it mean for where people came from? What does it mean for those relationships that existed in 1845 in a state like Alabama or Kentucky or wherever? And so I'll have a burning question. So I had those questions in my mind because I had been reading slave narratives that Skip Gates had put together anew. They were on our bookshelf when I was growing up, but he had put them together anew. And I was reading them. I just had this vision of this man hanging, and that's the opening scene of this play, Fast Blood. And I said, well, why is he hanging? And then he wasn't dead. And I was like, ooh, why isn't he dead? And then there were people picking a man and a woman picking herbs and looking for game meat. And I said, oh, what happens if they run across them? So I ask questions, and then one question leads to another question, leads to another question, like that. And they're burning questions. And then I learned something about myself, my history, my neighbor's history. I have burning questions, I think.
That's interesting. I'd love to, hopefully we can circle back just about your process, because that's very interesting. But I think one of the things you're touching on here is very important. I think it's so important just to the current cultural conversations that we're having, is that idea of how do artists encourage greater empathy? C.S. Lewis had this great line where he said that when I read a good book, I become 100 men, meaning that you can see, or at least get some glimpse of the other, however you define the other. The late movie critic Roger Ebert said that movies were the greatest empathy machines in the world. Do you see that as the role of the playwright as well?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I've taught a lot of playwriting to young people. I taught on Rikers Island for 14 years, and I teach young men now who have been caught up in the justice system. And I teach television writing. And one of the most beautiful things that had ever happened when I was in Rikers is I tell them that about having to, okay, you didn't like this person, or no matter what kind of, whether it's a fantasy or absolutely gritty reality, here's your main character, often the you character. Now you've got to put yourself in the other person's shoes and figure out what their point of view is. And sometimes that's very challenging, and we'll talk about it. And one time this guy says, I don't care what their point of view is. And the guy next to him said, you know what? You should, because that's called something. And I remember it from school. And he thinks and he thinks, he says, it's called empathy. And when you have empathy, you can feel what somebody else is feeling, right? So I've had that conversation with a number of my young men who have, done bouts in Rikers. And I've kept in touch with several of them. And some of them are quite successful in their lives and are, executive type people and people who, social work people, community organizers. You know why? Because they get what it's like to feel for somebody else, and it's meant something in their life.
Wow.
No, I'm going to cry.
Oh, that's inspiring. It really is. That actually also prompts the next question. I mean, you've worked with so many different groups, but many of them are young adults or even younger, teenagers. Can you talk a little bit about those experiences, about taking your craft, but also what I would say is you're almost a ministry of playwriting, and how is that interaction with young people? Can you talk a little bit about that?
I love that term you just made up, sort of like a ministry of playwriting. It's true, because in playwriting, you get to see other people's point of view. I'm gonna roll a few things into this answer because you were talking about them. History, kids are like, history. I was like that too, history. And then I realized, no, what we're living now, these times we're in, these protests, this is history. You're going to be able to tell this story to people younger than you, and for them, it will be history. For you, it will be lived experience. And when I came to the understanding that history was simply a collection of people's stories, like lived stories, I became excited by it. Because in school I had been just 1492, Columbus, and I'd have questions, but they were never answered. How could Columbus discover a place? Weren't there people here already? All that. And when I'm going to invoke, my dear friend and first husband, who said, no, Judy, history is full of stories. And you have stories that we haven't heard because people like you have not been the dominant storyteller. So tell these stories. And, and kids, when I tell them that, I said, look, we go into schools with unheard voices. And understandably, a lot of the Black and brown kids look stricken when I say I'm from the American Slavery Project. And I tell them about that. And it's just, I get it, because I got that way in school when I would hear about slavery, enslavement, and, this kind of thing comes over them. And I just keep going. And I talk to them about the story of these people who lived in colonial New York and who were heroes and heroines to me, not because they were like, what they go to see in these hero movies, but that they actually endured a time in which they preserved their sense of humanity when people would take it from them. And I say, we're going to look at these burials. And then, of course, that wakes people up because they love skeletons and mummies and things like that. So I have these little cards that have the burial numbers and what was found in the grave. And then I teach them how to make characters. I, give them a character profile sheet that's kind of like a scavenger hunt. And gradually that sort of shame and embarrassment and whatnot goes away. And then I relate it to today. And I say, this isn't about your worth as a human being. It's not about these people's worth. It was about work. It was about making money through free labor, or, they had to buy a gunny sack for somebody to wear. So cheap labor, right? But free labor. I said, there are arguments about this today. Where do you see this today? And immediately the kids go, oh, minimum wage. I said, that's right. It's about not wanting to pay labor to, you know, for the work. It's about keeping all the money. And once they understand that, it frees them from this internalized sense of, well, if there wasn't something wrong with us or me or whatever, that wouldn't have happened. You know, I know what that is. And I'm not saying, you know, all Black and brown kids have internalized it to the degree that I just spoke. But there is that thing that I see. And, you know, and honestly, I'm really happy that I'm a, you know, Black woman that goes in the classroom and gets to talk with young Black people about that, because I get it, you know. Yeah, I don't know. Did I stray too far?
No, not at all. But it was a perfect segue into the next question, because obviously you could understand how the specific stories you were referencing would speak to young people of color. But I think what's equally important to understand is that the stories you're telling, it's important for I think the general population to know that this is not just about Black history. This is about American history. So could you talk a little bit about that? This is our story as a nation, and it's important to understand the good and the ideals, but also the failings of us as a nation as well.
It's back to that quote that you had by James Baldwin. You know, you've got to look it square in the face. This is all of our history. And I think for a very long time, a lot of people in this country would go, well, there's this Black problem in America. You know, it's the Black problem, this problem, the poverty problem, that I'm not Black, I'm not poor. It's this problem. But, you know, the kind of degenerate thinking that was required to own other human beings, to do the work for you that you didn't want to do yourself, that infects everyone. Do you know? That infects the people perpetrating as well as the people upon whom that condition is perpetrated. And that is a shared history between us. You know, and people can go, well, you know, I've had this said to me countless times, and often it's not even true. Well, you know, I didn't have any slave owners in my family. My ancestors were poor, or we didn't get here until XYZ. But when you got here, if you were Swedish or if you were Irish, this fiction known as the white race, you could be absorbed in it, and you could give up your ethnic culture, your Swedishness or your Irishness or your Englishness or your whateverness, you know, to be absorbed into the American protective state of whiteness, which Black people didn't have, you know, a choice to do. And then we inherited all of that other colorism, right? I mean, look at me. You know, has there been privilege? Yes, bestowed upon light-skinned Black people by the dominant culture, because somehow, you know, a light-skinned Black person may look a little more like you, and so not as threatening in spaces where you are, that kind of thing. You know, it's damage done to all of us, you know, and I think we're beginning to realize this as more people are beginning to identify as non-white who have maybe never thought about it. You know, I know that there are South Asians and Middle Eastern people who really never identified as people of color in the country until 9/11, and they started being targeted or persecuted. They hadn't had to think about it really. They just, you know, and then suddenly they were people of color. And then we have more Asian, from the broad diaspora of where, Asian people come in this country. And after several events, we know what they are. My Asian friends were told, where did you come from? Go home, especially after this terrible, Asian, several Asian, nasty things that have been said by the government today. And so now I think that people start to understand, oh, this is a sickness that everybody has gotten, for as long as this, country has been established. Certainly the founders of this country, if you read Thomas Jefferson's writing, oh, he was conflicted. He has terrible, terrible statements about the inferiority of Black people. And then he has these powerful writings about the conflict between his heart and his head, because he was having, a rateful relationship with Sally Hemings, who he owned, but who he had who he had feelings for, but would not free in this horrific, complicated,
yes, it's the
relationship. I don't even want to. It's hard to call it a relationship. It was not. But
it's it's obviously there's a lot of complexity to all these issues that you as an artist try to grapple with in your writing. It's reminds me of the great Russian novelist Solzhenitsyn always said, and I'll probably misquote it slightly, but like the line between good and evil goes right through the human heart. That there's that mixture. But one interesting thing that I've noticed about observing your productions is you really seem to let your productions be your statements, for lack of a better way of saying it, and I think I read somewhere that you said that you don't feel the need to issue statements, that you're writing, the performances, the theater that you create are your statements. Is that accurate? Do you feel that you're
yeah because a lot of theaters were making statements and being called upon to make statements. I think that if anybody goes to the American Slavery Project's website and looks at the page where it says what our purpose is and why we exist, that is our statement. Of course, Black lives matter. We are, and we examine the history of Black people in America from our very beginnings to today. So I don't know why I should stop working on the project that I'm working on, which is a lot, to make a particular statement. My work is my statement. And if you want to know what my statement is, see our work, which you can see on the
the American Slavery Project.
and right, and the American Slavery Project website as well. And yeah, and I don't mind. I'm not criticizing anybody who's done that. I think it's wonderful and important. And there are people who have said that as theater artists, we need to come together. We need to. But what we have accomplished together in our 3 partnerships, and then what we just accomplished partnering with, I think, Sheen, Crossroads Theater, American Slavery Project, and 13 other theaters and organizations, because you do theater, but you're a large organization than that. That's astounding. It's astounding. We were little and we had this product and we were like, let's change how it's delivered. And so we could turn ourselves around really fast because we are very small. And so we did that in record time. And thank you so much for seeing the value of it and saying, yeah, let's do it. Because we're going to do it in person, right? But it doesn't look like there's going to be much in person anytime soon.
Well, I got a few more questions. I want to be respectful of your time. So let's just change direction for. I'm going to ask you for a second to take off the playwright hat and put on the historian hat, because I know you're extremely knowledgeable about many different stages of our country's history. Obviously, as a Catholic Arts Center, we always try to incorporate a little church into every conversation. And as a historian, can you speak to the historical role of the various Black churches in the civil rights movement, and maybe even the lead up to the civil rights movement?
Yeah, that is very kind of you. I am not really a historian. I go to the historians, and I go to them and I learn. So that's really kind of you. And it's funny too, because I grew up in the Congregationalist church, and then there were other churches. Southern Black churches were established not, after enslavement, as community places where you could not only worship, but where people who had not been able to read, because the first people to learn to read were the people closest to the people who owned them, right? I mean, just makes sense, right? So my grandparents' generation, they were people in the houses, they were educated. Some of the people who owned them educated their bastard offspring. That my family was educated. So those churches were gathering places for education, for for books, for strategizing about how to live safely among the people who most recently owned us. Black people and white people had gone to church together, mostly so white people could keep an eye on. They fed them religion in certain. They didn't let them read, but they fed them the parts of the Bible that would keep them docile. And then, of course, other people, some of the Black people learned to read, and we're like, wait a minute, there's other parts of this Bible here, and we can strategize, we can fight. But they wanted to go, to church alone, and so they created the African Methodist Episcopal Church. The AME Church was a huge church. And through the years, that evolved into, during the Civil Rights era, where did we go to organize? The church. Martin Luther King was the reverend of his church, Reverend, Abernathy. And so, when people decided to boycott the buses because, we live in a capitalist society and money talks. So when they don't get our nickels and dimes riding the buses for over a year, it's going to hurt. That was organized. People just didn't happen to go, let's just not, little by little, step by step, and the churches helped to organize. The Quakers were just incredible abolitionists during the Civil Rights Movement. Who was on the front lines? Catholic priests, right? I'm forgetting the man's name. He was killed in the Civil. I'm so sorry. I should know this priest's name. He gave up his life in the name of civil rights. I'm getting chilled because he was so important to us. So the church has been very, very instrumental in the move for equity, in this country, the constant move for equity. Hey, you guys are going to, canonize Dorothy Day, right?
Yeah, she's up for canonization. Yes.
Oh, that's exciting.
Her ministry started literally right down the block from the Sheen Center. So we have a particular connection with Dorothy Day. Okay, so maybe before we let you go, I'll ask you to put your playwriting hat one more time, because I got one more question I'd love to ask. I'm asking you to switch that hat a lot. Many hats, absolutely. Over the centuries, artists have always tended to speak to the moral issues of their day. Whether it was Charles Dickens writing about the suffering of industrialized England, or obviously here in our country, one could think of Harriet Beecher Stowe writing Uncle Tom's Cabin about the evils of slavery. were there any particular writers that influenced you, inspired you, kind of awakened your, C.S. Lewis, again, who's a favorite writer of mine, used the term that a writer, George MacDonald, baptized his imagination. It was like that writer that really sparked that flame in you to say, I want to use my gift as a writer to hopefully affect change.
Yeah, it's interesting. I went to a school in Chicago, on the south side of Chicago, an all-black school, St. Edmunds. And we were lucky. We were so lucky that we had Black teachers who cared about our education. So we studied the classics. I read a lot of Charles Dickens. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. I loved his storytelling. And so when I became older, I, of course, loved novels. But I loved poets, too. I loved Paul Laurence Dunbar and would memorize Paul Laurence Dunbar alongside Longfellow. I loved poets for their ability to use language in an imagistic way. And so then when I became an adult and learned of Toni Morrison and her writing, I gobbled up everything that she wrote. And I'd say she's influential in my work, in that she had magic and spiritual and ghostly things living right beside the present. My grandfather was, on my father's side, was a doctor. And so I have this very science-oriented kind of mind. And his wife was the organist for our church and worked the Ouija board. And so this idea of the ancestors talking to you and, ghosts in the house and science all kind of lived very, very comfortably together in my being, in my imagination. So magical realism is really something for me. So I love Toni Morrison for her magical realism. I love Marquez, love in the time of coronavirus, love in the time of cholera. Love him as a writer. Love Octavia Butler, because she was the first Black person, I'm not sure, but Black woman certainly, to work in science fiction. I loved Gene Roddenberry because Star Trek took all of the present day social issues we had and put them in a science fiction future universe for us to be able to have enough distance to say, oh, that's not now, but that's just like now. So I love that. James Baldwin, of course, I mentioned James Baldwin. I love, Barbara King. So I could go on and on. Isabel Allende, Sumant Kid. I read a lot of different writers. I read, yes, a lot of African-American writers, a lot of writers from the diaspora, but I read just lots of different writers from different cultures and countries. And I'm sorry I left so many out. Salman Rushdie.
Got a lot in there. And again, it's all the storytellers. They're storytellers in their own way. So I guess we'll close with that well-known quote by George Santayana about those who refuse to learn from the past are doomed to relive it. Any final thoughts about how we are doomed to relive that past if we don't learn from the mistakes?
Yeah, but I have hope. Somebody who was in juvenile justice said that there was a report done that said that the kids who left juvenile justice with hope were the least likely to return. And so may I say that these young people out here now, they're Black, they're white, they're brown, they're yellow, they are multicultural, and they are determined. They are not giving up. And it gives us such hope. And when you have it, and I don't look at hope as this airy fairy thing. Hope is the ability to see a future that does not exist now. And I think that we can get there. I think we can.
Well, it's a wonderful way to tie things up. I mean, the name of our series is the Faith, Hope, and Love series. So,
oh, that's right. I did.
we'll end with hope. Judy, it's been a pleasure speaking with you. I want to thank you for being with us today. I think it was, speaking of playwrights, a pretty good one. I think it was William Shakespeare who said that theater is holding a mirror up to nature. And I think a little later, it was George Bernard Shaw who said that it's a mirror that allows you to look into your soul. So I want to thank you for, again, that ministry of playwriting, for holding that mirror up, allowing us to collectively look into our soul at a time where, there needs to be self-reflection, but to look at it, as you just said, with eyes of hope, because hopefully that's how we can look at ourselves, at our current moment, at our nation, at our world, because we need that hope. So thank you for that, and thank you for all that you do.
Oh, thank you. And thank you for finding it relevant and finding what I do in my little corner of the world, something that other people might want to hear about. I really appreciate it.
It was our pleasure. And again, American Slavery Project's right there at the bottom of the screen if you want to find out more information. And I'd also like to thank our viewers. If you value this kind of programming, we encourage you to consider making a donation to the Sheen Center. No matter how small the gift, it makes a big difference, because we certainly want to continue bringing you this type of programming that leads with faith, leads with hope, and leads with love. We ask you to check out all our content on sheencenter.org. We invite you to next week's streaming event on Wednesday. And until then, stay safe, be well, God bless.